Hello and welcome to the struggle for food. I'm Ros Childs. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has set off a disastrous chain reaction, threatening to tip tens of millions of people into food insecurity, malnutrition, mass hunger and famine in a crisis that could last for years. If the war drags on and supplies of grain from Ukraine and Russia are limited, people across Africa, Asia and the Middle East will slip into poverty. Political unrest will spread and people will starve. European officials say Russia is using food supplies as a stealth missile against the developing world. The warring nations produce 30% of the world's wheat, barley and half of its sunflower oil. Russia and Belarus are the world's number 2 and 3 producers of potash, a key ingredient of fertilizer. And the key Ukrainian ports of Odessa and Chornomorsk and others are cut off by Russian warships. The Ukrainians have also mined parts of the Black Sea. And Russian ports in Crimea are restricted because of sanctions. According to the United Nations, 276 million people are at risk of starvation. Global food prices have risen by nearly 1/3, fertiliser by more than half, and oil prices by almost 2/3. Well, the World Bank warns the hopes of averting recession for all countries, large and small, will fade the longer the war in Ukraine goes on. It predicts economies around the world will experience their sharpest deceleration in more than 80 years. It says East Africa and less developed countries in Europe will be among those worst affected.
As the world watches the raw brutality of Russia's war in Ukraine, out of view, Moscow is waging another conflict that could take an even higher human toll. Ukraine is one of the world's largest exporters of grain, but Russia has blocked its ports in the Black Sea, leaving Ukraine's last harvest stuck in storage facilities, and the next with no place to be stored.
There are 84 Ukrainian ships that have been blocked in the Black Sea. I'm told that there is about 25 million tons of grain that is available to be transported and provided to humanitarian programs as well as to those who are dependent on Ukrainian wheat.
According to the World Food Program, 1.7 billion people worldwide are facing increased poverty due to rising food prices, driven by Russia's blockade of Ukraine's ports. And if it continues, 47 million people could face starvation.
Failure to open those ports will result in famine, destabilization, and mass migration around the world.
Ukraine alone supplies 42% of the world's sunflower oil, more than 16% of all maize, or corn, nearly 10% of the world's barley, and about 9% of all wheat. Most attention is being paid to Ukraine's wheat crop, which is crucial to a number of developing countries' supplies of bread, a basic staple. The most vulnerable among the main recipients of Ukraine's wheat include Bangladesh, Turkey, Yemen, and Lebanon.
Bread prices in Lebanon have increased by 70%. And on top of this, Russia is now hoarding its own food exports as a form of blackmail, holding back supplies to increase global prices or trading wheat in exchange for political support.
The African Union has warned EU leaders that Moscow's blockade of Ukraine's ports risks a catastrophic scenario. The World Food Program says drought-ravaged countries across the Horn of Africa are likely to be hit the hardest. Already, the cost of a food basket in Ethiopia has risen by 66%, while in Somalia, the cost is up by 36%.
Just when you think it couldn't get any worse over a year ago, you had Ethiopia, then you had Afghanistan, and then the bread basket of the world. This now got the longest bread lines of the world. And so now, because of this crisis, we're taking food from the hungry to give to the starving.
2 years of pandemic-stressed supply chains had already driven up food prices. Now, Russia's war on Ukraine is fast becoming a war on global food security.
Let's get the latest on the crisis from those on the front line. Michael Dunford is the Regional Director for Eastern Africa for the United Nations Food Programme, and Bernadette Mukunyora is with the International Fund for Agricultural Development and is in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Hello to you both. Michael, to you first of all, what's happening in Eastern Africa in terms of food supplies, food prices, and just people getting enough to eat?
Thanks very much, Ros. I think your story at the top gave a very good overview of the situation that's happening globally. We have a global food crisis today, and the reality is that it's going to get worse before it improves. In Eastern Africa, we estimate that the number of people who are acutely food insecure, acutely hungry, is now at 84 million. That's up from 50 million just last year. The way the situation is deteriorating, we expect that number will continue to rise. And it's a culmination of ongoing conflicts in Tigray, in Somalia, in South Sudan, the effects of climate change playing out in real time now with droughts in at least 3 of the countries, and now, of course, the economic impact of COVID. All of those factors together, now with the war in Ukraine, we're seeing a dramatic spike in prices and higher levels of vulnerability across the region.
Michael, how close are people now to actual famine?
Tragically, we are at very real risk of a famine in the Horn throughout the course of the remainder of this year. We've had analysis undertaken in Somalia, for example. They estimate that there could be up to 200,000 people in famine-like conditions by September. So the World Food Programme and other humanitarian organizations are mobilizing, we have been since last year, to try and avert this disaster. But unless we get the levels of funding required, and unless we see an end to conflicts both regionally and globally, I fear that people are going to die.
Bernadette, you're in Ethiopia. We've been hearing there from Michael about how bad conditions are across the region, but what's the particular situation where you are?
Well, no, thank you very much. Your statistics was very clear. Food prices are going up anything between 30% and 60%. We have to also understand that the impacts of this crisis are not only being felt in Russia and Ukraine, but they are being felt at the household. My concern are the poor, right? And let's think about the poor rural smallholder farmers. Think about that woman in South Sudan who relies on agriculture. And we have to also know that the poor spend a significant part of their income on food. So with greater or higher food prices that we have heard, and I think your statistics are very clear, we know that their incomes are going to be eroded, their assets are also going to be eroded. So indeed, as my colleague Michael is saying, more people will move down into poverty, more people will move into hunger. So this is a situation which has to be looked at. One other issue is the question around the fertilizer as well and the agriculture supply chains. These people rely on agriculture as their main livelihoods. The commodities that you presented in your statistics, they are the lifeline of the agriculture sector. So any increase in prices, we know that the prices of fertilizer have gone up by maybe 20%, depending on where you are. Fuel 70%, depending on where you are. So that will definitely have an impact on rural households, on women. I'm talking about a woman in a village in the county of Torit in South Sudan. This is a decision point between continuing to farm and feed your family or stopping and joining the millions who are already under humanitarian assistance, as Michael has said.
So Bernadette, how do you see the future then, and what can be done to combat the conditions people in Ethiopia are facing?
Well, I think we have to provide the short-term support. My colleague Michael talked about the need for further assistance. A lot of people will need a buffer from the shock, right? So we need a parallel structure. How do you address those short-term needs? From the context of IFAD, we are setting up a crisis response initiative. It's called CRI. And we are really looking now to say, what are those immediate needs? It could be some financing, a cash transfer, immediate cash injection, which allows a family to buy food and perhaps to buffer those high costs. With the energy that they get, they are able to go back into farming. It could also be providing perhaps lower cost or subsidized inputs, the fertilizer, the fuel, the seeds, pesticides, what they need to be able to go back into farming or continue to farm. We are in a farming season already as we speak. Looking at a country like Somalia, we know that food prices have gone up by over 300%, right? Animals are dying because of the drought, which Michael has talked about. A lot of them are weak as well, and they cannot be sold. Vegetables are wilting. So you need, and we need as a global community, to avail resources for short-term support, which will also complement with the longer-term sustainable development. So IFAD's Crisis Response Initiative is one such instrument. I'm sure there are many. My colleague from WFP has also spoken about that. But a parallel track, let's also not forget the longer-term sustainable development. Yes.
So, Michael, funding resources are finite, of course. So how are you choosing now where to send those resources? How are you deciding who needs help more than others?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're being forced to make very difficult decisions, prioritizing those who are the most vulnerable. And unfortunately, across the region, we have huge numbers. The drought that we've referred to, there are currently 16 million people impacted. This will rise to 20 million by the end of the year. Without the levels of funding that we require, we really have to focus on those most at risk of dying. And this, of course, is the children. We've seen a massive spike in the number of people or children that are malnourished. It's now 7 million across the region. Then, of course, we've got pregnant and feeding mothers who are equally vulnerable. And if we don't feed them today, and if we don't give them what is required now, they'll never be able to achieve their potential in their future lives.
So a quick final question to you both. Do you feel frustration that it's really since food prices and imports to Western countries are beginning to bite because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that the world is starting to talk now about food insecurities when people in your region and country have been facing such dire situations for so long? A brief answer, if I could ask for that. Bernadette, to you first of all, briefly.
Well, definitely, I think, this is a wake-up call for everybody. The issue of food security and food insecurity, hunger, malnutrition, poverty, this is all showing us that the world is connected. The Russia and Ukraine crisis is taking place very far away from the villages that we've talked about, the villages in Somalia, the villages in South Sudan, but the impacts are far-reaching. And we need to look at that. We need to think about how to support African countries, how to support developing countries to become food self-sufficient. They need to start growing their food. But to do that, they need support. The institution I work for, IFAD, is doing just that. We work with developed countries, we receive funding, and we mobilize all that funding in other additional co-financing, and we invest in agriculture development, particularly the rural smallholder farmers.
And Michael,
they are the back.
Apologies for interrupting, Bernadette. A quick answer from you.
Of course, I'm frustrated that we're at this point, but there is still an opportunity for us to respond, provided the levels of funding start to flow. We've made an enormous effort to raise awareness, to raise the issues of the needs in the Horn. It's now for the governments around the world to invest through the World Food Programme and others to avert a catastrophe, to avert a famine. There is no need for populations to die at this point, but we must act now.
Michael Dunford and Bernadette Mukunyora, thank you both.
Thank you.
The situation at the moment is bad, but if the conflict in Ukraine becomes a stalemate, then the food crisis will only get worse. Before the war, Taras Topolia was a professional singer. He's now a volunteer with the Ukrainian forces, and he joins us now from Kharkiv. Taras, thanks so much for being with us. How's the battle going?
Hello, everybody. I'm fine. And first of all, I want to add, you were talking about food crisis, yeah? Am I right?
Sorry, can you say that again, Taras?
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
You were talking about food crisis, am I right?
Yes, we were talking about food crisis, yes.
So the food crisis was predictable from the first day of the war. So, and you know, and everybody know that Russia blocked a lot of Ukrainian grains in the south of Ukraine. And first of all, what we should to do, what the world society should to do to deblockade these grains and to let this grain come to the European and world markets. Of course, and we know that the key which solved this problem in Russian hands. So first of all, we should to do this, I think. And what we're doing now here in Ukraine, we resist Russian aggression, but we cannot do more. We cannot deblocate Ukrainian grain and cannot, unfortunately, let this grain to come to the European and world markets. And this is the mission for world society, United Nations, to organize special maybe force mission to do this. And, you know, it's very interesting and it's very painful for me to see how in United Nations a lot of African countries are voting support Russia. But in that time, African countries food that blocked by Russians. So this is the problem. I think this is solve of this problem. It's first of all. And if to talk about your question, now I'm with my friends, with my colleagues, musicians of Antitela Band. We are serving in Ukrainian military forces, territorial defense forces in Kharkiv region, and we slowly, step by step, are recapturing Ukrainian villages and cities from Russian occupiers. So it's slowly, but it takes a lot of power to do this.
And how are you getting access to food, and how are the local Ukrainians, the citizens who are living in the cities that you've been in, how are they getting access to enough food, Taras?
You know, Ukraine have a lot of grain. Maybe just 15% from average Ukrainian grains, it's Ukrainian needs. But 85% every year Ukraine's exported to the European and world countries. So here in Ukraine, we are okay with this. But we very want world to help us to deblocate this grain and to let this grain come to European and world markets.
So what's morale like for you and your colleagues now, Taras, just over 3 months since Russia invaded? Are you as determined as ever to fight on, no matter how long it takes?
Our morale is good, high morale, and we are brave Ukrainian soldiers. I can tell this definitely. And first of all, by the way, I want to say thank you Australian people to helping us, to supporting us by the weapons. And you know, if we have more weapons, we will do much more faster our work. Much more faster we will recapture Ukrainian cities and establish the peace on our territory and get this victory in our country, our victory.
Taras Topolia, very good to talk to you. Thank you so much. Bread plays a significant role in Middle Eastern life. It is a daily ritual and no meal is complete without it. But people in Lebanon are now queuing for bread as bakeries run out of flour and prices skyrocket on the black market.
Why did you restrict the sale to 2 packs of bread?
We restricted the sale to 2 packs of bread because our production is low. If we did not do so, you would see a long queue at the door, and we don't want that. One day the bread won't be subsidised anymore. If that happens, it will be sold in dollars. As a result, the loaf of bread will reach 30,000 to 35,000 Lebanese pounds, depending on the dollar rate. The people can bear anything, but don't touch the bread. When the Lebanese currency was pegged to the dollar, the loaf was about 1,500 Lebanese pounds, equivalent to $1. Now it costs 42 cents. For us, it is cheaper, and it's affecting our revenues. Right now, we are sacrificing our revenues because it's not the right time to raise the price. It's our duty to provide food and drink to the people. The crisis started with the explosion in the silos. It was our strategic wheat stockpile. Now, each shipment lasts 2 to 3 weeks, and it is directly distributed to the mills. We used to have a strategic stockpile for at least a month, and on top of that, we're not importing anymore.
I find the bread expensive because my salary is in Lebanese pounds. If I earned dollars, it would be okay for me. Bread is essential to complement all meals.
I would be happy if it were cheaper. It piles up at the end of the month, as every day we need at least 2 or 3 packs. We cannot live without bread, as we do sandwiches for the school and university, and we eat it in meals. We cannot live without it.
The conflict in Ukraine is hammering the global food supply system, which has already been weakened by the COVID pandemic, climate change and the energy shock. Here to discuss how to avert global famine instability and help those in need is David McNair, the Executive Director at the One campaign. That's a global movement to end extreme poverty. Chikondi Chabruta from CARE, an international humanitarian agency in Zimbabwe, and Bashir Omar from the International Committee of the Red Cross in Yemen. Hello to you all. David McNair, can I start with you? How worried are you and your organisation about global food shortages and how bad they may become?
This is really a worrying situation. I mean, we saw a very bad situation in 2008. This looks to be much worse. And as you said, Russia and Ukraine are together the breadbasket of the world. They export about 30% of the world's wheat, a quarter of the world's barley, 70% of sunflower oil. And since the invasion, we've seen food prices skyrocket. The UN Food Price Index hit its highest ever level in March. But of course, this isn't isolated. It comes on top of COVID, poor harvests, drought, extreme weather events that have been driven by climate change and conflict. So for people who are already in crisis, the cost of the humanitarian response is increasing because the cost of grains is increasing. But there are also many, many more people. So there are about 250,000 people who are facing technical famine, which basically means death and starvation. But there are another 30 million, and that population is larger than the total population of Australia, that are facing a food emergency, meaning families can only eat by selling all their assets and some of their family members will die. And on top of that, you've got a third category, about 100 million people, about the population of the Philippines, who are in food crisis, meaning that they face acute malnutrition because they don't have enough food. So this is a really worrying situation, and we need global leaders to respond to this, because it's not just about charity and helping people who are in desperate need. It's also a matter of stability. We saw how food prices drove instability and uprisings during the Arab Spring. The scale of this situation is much, much greater, and we need a massive response to it now.
To you, Chikondi, you're in Zimbabwe. How are people there managing day to day?
So the situation in Southern Africa has really been desperate, because we have been just recovering from cyclones that have taken away most of the crop. Then we have areas in Northern Africa where there is a drought that has gone on unprecedented levels. And we have seen soaring prices of fuel and availability of wheat, raising prices of bread, and really it is making life unbearable. We thought that when we had recovery plans from COVID, we would actually be able to be on a trajectory to meet the food security needs for the people. But what the people are facing now are dire situations where even the fertilizer prices are too high to even go and do winter cropping. We have situations where now people are contemplating what will be available in the next few months, because the cyclones took away most of what was planted in the last season. This is the period where there's recovery through winter cropping, but the prices of fertilizer have more than doubled, and they're even expecting them to go higher. So the situation is really dire and a bit hopeless, really, to look at how people will be coping in the next few months.
Chikondi, as we heard earlier in the programme, it's always those who are already struggling who are impacted the most in these situations. So how can organisations like yours cope in helping the poor in Zambia in the face of what's being called a perfect storm.
So what CARE is doing is really doing advocacy, working on ensuring that the trade lines are open, really ensuring that wheat is made available, food is made available, but also having an exposure to the already existing crises that were taking place on the continent, and really helping colleagues see that there was already this crisis, which now has been made higher due to the impacts of the conflict. So we are really trying to see how can we bring humanitarian assistance to those in need? How can we ensure that the almost famine situations that communities are experiencing are averted through humanitarian aid, and really bringing to light this situation so that others would know, and really make sure that trade lines are open, but also ensuring that the food supply chain itself is able to be managed to ensure that the situation does not get out of control. If we do not manage the situation, if we do not assist those who are in need, we might face catastrophic levels of death due to unavailability of food and really unbearable living costs that communities are experiencing.
Bashir Omar from the International Committee of the Red Cross in Yemen. Now, Bashir, war has already pushed Yemen into the world's largest humanitarian crisis. We can only imagine what's happening now with all the other threats to food security. How bad is it there?
Yeah, as you know, the conflict in Yemen has been ongoing since 2015. And when we talk about Yemen, we talk about more than 16 million people are food insecure in the country. More than 4.71 women and children are acutely malnourished in the country. These people are in critical need for different kind of support. We see since the onset of the conflict in the country, the cost of living, has skyrocketed. The price of food baskets, has increased by more than 150%. Since the onset of the conflict. So we see the conflict in other contexts, like the conflict in Ukraine and in many other countries, are affecting also Yemen in different ways. You know that Yemen is importing more than 80% of its food needs from outside the country, from abroad. So when we talk about shortages in food coming to the country, that ultimately would aggravate the already dire situation in the country by pushing more people into hunger or maybe starvation. So we see increase in food prices, meaning more families will not be able to feed their children and themselves.
Bashir, what is it that locals there need the most? How can people help?
People here in Yemen, they need food. This is number one. Food security is number one for anyone in this planet. So in the ICRC, we are doing our best to provide food items to millions of people across the country. For example, last year we helped more than 5 million people in different parts of the country, more specifically IDPs and children who have been fleeing the country. In Yemen, there are more than 3 million people who are IDPs across the country. They are in need or in dire support for food and non-food items, and we are trying to do our best. But we cannot in Yemen, we cannot respond to this massive crisis in the country.
David McNair, you said earlier that global leaders should come together to find a solution to this. Do you have any confidence that that will happen?
Well, we are hopeful that the scale of the challenge will be met by an adequate response. And I think we need to do three things. First, we need to make sure that the humanitarian response is fully funded, and also make sure that countries aren't making the situation worse by imposing export bans on grains and fertilizer, which could increase the prices further. Second, we need to step up economic support to vulnerable countries, because the cost of energy and food imports is pushing some countries into debt distress. And then finally, we need to address these underlying issues when it comes to food production and resilience to climate shocks. But there is one specific thing that I think Australia could do. Last year, it received about 12 billion Australian dollars from the International Monetary Fund. that it doesn't need. Most other major economies have agreed to transfer their allocations, they got them to support poorer countries in their response to COVID and the food emergency and the climate crisis. So even if Australia was to share a quarter of that 12 billion, it would make a massive difference. And we'd love to see Australia kind of stepping up and playing that role on the international stage.
David McNair, Chikondi Chavuta and Bashir Omar, thank you all so much. Nearly half the population of Afghanistan is facing acute hunger in what's being described as the worst food crisis the country has ever seen. Drought and the economic collapse brought on by the return of the Taliban have made life difficult for many, but the added pressure of the war in Ukraine is proving catastrophic. Earlier, I spoke to Athena Rayburn from Save the Children in Afghanistan and started by asking her how desperate the situation is.
The food crisis in Afghanistan is incredibly desperate at the moment. There are almost 10 million children going hungry every day. Families that we've spoken to in the last few weeks have told us that they're surviving on one single loaf of bread for up to a week, mixing it with water to make it go further for them and their children. And we're meeting families that have told us that they've been forced to consider exchanging their child for money just so they'll have enough to eat.
What were the primary drivers of the food crisis in Afghanistan before the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
The food situation in Afghanistan was already incredibly insecure. Afghanistan has long been one of the most food insecure countries on the planet, and before even the events of last August, we were already looking at a drought which was affecting crop yields, it was affecting access to clean water, and we were also still dealing with the aftermath of COVID-19, the pandemic here, which caused crushing unemployment, reducing families' ability to even buy food, even if it's available on the market.
How's the war in Ukraine made things worse?
The price of fuel has skyrocketed in recent months, and that's increasing the cost of transport for basic goods such as flour, wheat and oil. In turn, we're seeing that impact in the markets in Afghanistan, where basic things like rice and bread have almost doubled in cost in just the last 2 months.
What are your fears for people in Afghanistan if the war in Ukraine and the shortages of wheat and cooking oil continue?
Before the war in Ukraine, Afghanistan and Afghan people were already on the brink. And with the impacts of the war, increasing food prices and fuel, it's pushing Afghan people into a space where they might not be able to recover from. We're already seeing one of the worst economic crises ever in Afghanistan. Families don't even have access to cash or jobs. And if the cost of basic goods continue to go up, even more people will continue to be dependent on humanitarian aid. And the other worry we have is that with the war in Ukraine, the amount of aid Afghanistan is receiving is going to continue to decline. And the fact is, Afghan children will not be able to survive without increased humanitarian aid and returned global attention.
Well, the war has sent shockwaves through international food markets, which were already at their highest levels since the 1970s. And the climate emergency is another driver of global hunger. Joining us now is Simon Bradshaw from the Climate Council, specialising in the global food crisis. And in Canberra is Ash Saladini, Chief Economist from the National Farmers Federation. Hi there. Simon, to you, first of all, we heard from Chikondi Chavuta from Zambia how extreme weather is affecting food production and food shortages there. How much is all this that we're seeing around the world the result of climate change?
Good evening, Ross. Well, the sad thing is that we saw a couple of decades of declines in global hunger leading up to around 2015, 2016. Those were very hard-fought gains. But since then, we have seen global hunger on the rise again quite significantly. And it is clear that climate change, along with conflict and other factors, is a key element in this. Now, that's for a couple of reasons. With climate change, we see shifting rainfall patterns, prolonged droughts, and then sometimes a lot of rain coming on all at once and wiping out harvests. We also see an increase in extreme weather disasters, be that more powerful cyclones that again can wipe out harvests in a stroke. Is making it harder for communities in many parts of the world to grow and buy enough food to eat. Tragically, of course, the impacts are felt first and hardest in the poorest and more vulnerable parts of the world. The same communities have contributed the very least to the global climate crisis.
Ash Saladini now from the National Farmers Federation. While we in Australia have undoubtedly seen the impacts of climate change with the bushfires and, of course, the recent floods, farmers here are enjoying good times, aren't they, with bumper crops and high prices?
Yes, they are. And look, so this is probably a record year in terms of the harvest. The gross product at the farm gate is at $80 billion. And so it's been a great year for farmers. However, we also, worry about food security globally as well, and the challenges of addressing climate change, and also the challenge of addressing food security. And I think one of the things that we haven't done very well is actually address those two issues together. So we've either seen a trade-off between addressing climate change or a trade-off with securing food security. So we need to actually optimise those things together. So we need to have climate policies that actually promote food security as well, so not at the expense of food production. And frankly, there's some first world countries, including the European Union, who have actually compromised food security by prioritising climate policies that actually reduce food production, such as reforestation strategies of productive agricultural land.
So, Ash, with big crop surpluses here, as you've described, and exports are at record levels this year, aren't they? Are Australian farmers in a position to help people in those parts of the world that we've been hearing about who are facing food shortages?
So we do have to put it into perspective. Australia creates about 60 to 80 million people's worth of food, so we can definitely be part of the solution. But noting that there's billions of people in food insecurity, we are a drop in the ocean somewhat. But we need countries who can produce food cost effectively and produce it in a surplus manner to actually step up and be able to trade and be able to supply global markets. And I think this has actually demonstrated the importance of having free markets and global markets, because we do rely on global supply chains to feed the world, and it's not a joke. We do need to keep those lines open, whether it's just trying to stamp out export restrictions, but also things like domestic supports and domestic protections, which is stopping exports at the other end of the supply chain.
Simon Bradshaw from the Climate Council. Now, there was always a fear that food crises could develop on several continents at once. That's what we're seeing now, isn't it? With droughts in Africa, the US wheat belt, floods in China, the heat wave in India. Are we now in new territory?
It is a very serious situation we're seeing right now, as you've been exploring over the last half hour. I would like to pick up on an important point that Ash made there, which is that we can deal with climate change and support security at the same time. And that means getting the right support to small-scale producers, who are often really the backbone of food security in many parts of the world. It means that here in Australia, we are supporting farmers who have a critical role to play in dealing with climate change, and being able to do that, whether that's improving the carbon in our soil, supporting biodiversity, working in the land in ways that is both productive and more resilient, and also is ensuring that food security. We are seeing a terrible situation unfold, but how bad that gets really depends on the actions that we take now. And by that, I'm talking about far stronger action to bring down emissions. Australia needs to go much further, catch up with the rest of the world, play its part in dealing with the global climate crisis, but then also really listening to farmers here in Australia and elsewhere, working out what additional support is needed so that they're able to adapt to these changing conditions. Farmers are no strangers to adversity and to having to adapt, and are able to do that in ways that's also helping deal with the climate crisis at the same time.
So, Simon, is there some cause for optimism with a change of leadership here in Australia, of course, and also in the US?
Look, we lost a decade of inaction in Australia, which was tragic. We've got a whole lot of catching up to do, but there is now the opportunity for a total reset. It starts with being far more ambitious in our actions this decade, really setting Australia's emissions plummeting, and doing that in ways that's leaving all Australian communities stronger and more prosperous and more secure with their energy and with their food. But of course, we're talking here about the global food crisis. Australia is a major emitter and contributor to climate change, but we've also got enormous capacity to be not only reining in our own emissions, but supporting decarbonisation and the global move beyond fossil fuels. That's the most important thing we need to focus on if we are, as we rightly should be, worried about food security and hunger globally.
So, Ash, crop prices here, as you said, are doing well, but looking ahead, are profit margins looking a little shaky because of rising energy costs, and also are farmers here going to be hit by those rising fertiliser prices? Russia, the world's biggest exporter of fertilisers, supply now, of course, restricted.
Yes, exactly right. So the cost of, for example, electricity has gone up about 140% in the wholesale markets. and particularly for commercial users such as dairy farmers, irrigators and other growers, horticulture. That's going to be passed on through to them quite quickly. So the average dairy farmer before this sort of price hikes was paying $100,000 to $150,000 for electricity. That's probably getting closer to $250,000, and that's going to be the difference between a profitable year and a year that you might make a loss. Now, the issue of fertiliser is not just a cost issue, and it is a massive cost issue, but if you don't have access and availability to fertilisers, synthetic fertilisers, crop yields go down by 30%. So in this country, we seem to take our food security and our ability to actually feed the world for granted, but without fertilisers, we are actually looking at potentially losing 20 to 30% of our crop yield. So it's a huge issue.
Ash Saladini and Simon Bradshaw, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Australian farmers are banding together to show their support for Ukraine. The Grain for Ukraine fundraising campaign aims to raise money for humanitarian support. West Australian wheat farmer David Fullwood is taking part in the campaign after forming a close bond with his Ukrainian counterparts.
I've got some good friends farming in Ukraine. I've been fortunate enough to visit them over the since 2006 was the first time I went to Ukraine to look at the production potential there, and have made some good friends in the process of visiting over the years and taking other farmers through the Nuffield Scholarship Program. We've spent sort of a week or 10 days there every second year looking at what's happening in agriculture in Ukraine.
So you've watched the rise of the whole wheat production industry in Ukraine. How well developed was it before the Russian invasion?
Yeah, look, it's become more and more advanced since I've been visiting. Since 2006 was very basic, and there was a lot of land that wasn't being utilised. But since then, the infrastructure's improved for grain logistics and grain production generally. So, it's ongoing, but I guess part of the interest in Ukraine is because there has been so many things holding them back, whether it's political or production or, some other factor. There always seems to be something holding them back, and I guess this is just another example of an extreme interruption to what the farmers in Ukraine are doing.
So what are your farming friends in Ukraine telling you about conditions now?
Yeah, so look, they have got crop in the ground. They've persisted with that, but there's a lot of uncertainty. I guess they've still got some of last year's production stored on farm, and they can't physically sell that. And now they're looking at producing another crop, which will be harvested in sort of later this year, middle to late this year, and they don't know what they're going to do with that. So it's very uncertain times, and obviously from a business point of view, if you can't produce income year to year, then at some point the farming operation is going to stop. So there's a lot of uncertainty still, and it's all based around the fact that they can't export grain out of Ukraine.
So how does the initiative Grain for Ukraine work?
Yeah, so there's a small group of farmers from across Australia who have got together and thought, imagine if we were going through something like this, and probably can't imagine if we were, but we just thought that given, our growing conditions last year were quite good and hopefully are good again this coming harvest, then we would, rally together and ask people to donate some grain. That grain will be sold and the funds will be put into some different projects in Ukraine to get them back on their feet. And, we'll be focusing on the areas that, the farmers live, and the villages and the people that have had their lives, totally turned upside down. We're looking at supporting them from a humanitarian point of view.
Well, David, how do you ensure that money gets to the farmers who really need it most?
Yeah, we've got some really good contacts over there on the ground. There's we're taking ideas from fellow farmers in Australia as to where that money should go, but also talking to a lot of people in Ukraine and finding out what they need the most. And, you know, we're looking to have a direct impact on the ground so that, yeah, the grain donated has a maximum impact to help the people over there.
That's WA wheat farmer David Forward there. That is the programme. I'm Ros Childs. Bye for now.